Here are two claims that you hear again and again and again. Number one, innovation is really good, and we should talk about innovation and we should push for innovation. Very important. Here's another kind of claim. We need regulations for AI to protect us from the worst that AI can do, and we should do it before the shit hits the fan. Both claims that innovation is really good, important, should be pursued, that seems plausible. It also seems plausible that we need regulations to protect us from the worst of AI. That said, the conversation that I have with Lee begins to push against these kinds of things, or at least forces us to think about it in a different way, which is one reason, or perhaps the reason, why I found the conversation so interesting. So, for instance, I'm just going to highlight a couple of claims that Lee makes here. There's lots of talk about what innovation. More specifically, there's hype around new technology. So there was hype around blockchain and certainly crypto. There's certainly lots of hype around AI right now. And aside from being annoying, it's also potentially counterproductive. So says Lee. Why? Because all this talk, all this hype makes it difficult for leaders to understand what's real and what's not. And so it's difficult to make decisions, informed decisions, about what kinds of opportunities they should pursue and what kinds of things that they should refrain from. So innovation hype, as Lee calls it, isn't just sort of silly. It's actually bad for what you might call, I believe what he calls, the informational environment. Okay, so that's one major claim. He has some other claims that that all the talk of innovation hasn't actually caused more innovation. That's another interesting point. Okay, let's turn to the other thing, though, this issue about regulations. Now, I've been of the view that we should have AI regulations to protect us from the worst that AI has to deliver, and let's do it proactively. Of course, right? You don't want to be reactive. You don't want to wait until the shit hits the fan. You want to do the stuff, you want to pass those regulations before those bad things happen, before people get hurt. Obviously. Except, as Lee points out, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the harms that come from a technology are how those technologies are used. And it turns out we're very bad at predicting how technologies will be used, how they'll be applied, what the uptake will be, what the impacts will be. We're just bad at that kind of thing. So, for instance, in the 90s, we wouldn't have predicted the way that social media causes depression among teenage girls or something along those lines. We had to sort of wait to see that happen. The concern or the fear is that we'll try to pass proactive regulations with false or shaky predictions about how the technologies might be used and thus how people might be harmed. And we'll pass regulations that don't protect anyone, actually, because they're not tracking how the technologies are actually used. And they'll unnecessarily hamper innovation, which is good even if innovation hype is not good. So those are the kinds of discussion, the kinds of claims that Lee is making. I find them quite persuasive, actually. Oh, one more thing that I find particularly interesting. We can have reactive regulations on the condition that we can pass those regulations sufficiently quickly. So one of the problems is a government problem, that it's so slow in reacting to bad things. And we've seen this, of course, with government's reaction to social media. So let's not focus on, if you like, the tech. Let's not just focus on regulation as such. Let's focus on a more systemic problem, the pace at which government passes effective regulation. It's the efficiency of regulation creation and implementation that is really arguably at the core of the problem, or at least so Lee argues, and I find that pretty persuasive. Okay, that's just by way of intro, of course. The conversation is a lot deeper than that. Lee is a great conversationalist, has really interesting points to make, so I hope you'll like the conversation. Before moving on to that conversation, though, remember, if you've got a recommendation for who I should talk to or a topic you'd like me to address, please email me. You can reach me at em, as in ethical machines, em@reedblackman.com. I will read your email for sure. And by the way, please review the podcast, give it 5 stars, write a quick review, tell your friends about it, etc. Always trying to get the word out. Oh, and if you've read my book and you like it, also please go to Amazon and give it a 5-star rating, because apparently the algorithm really, really cares about that kind of thing. All right, thanks so much, and let's get to the conversation with Lee. All right, Lee. So I like people who like to throw a wrench in things. I was, often accused as, yucking people's yums. Feels to me like you want to yuck people's yums for innovation, which I love because everyone loves innovation. Innovation is so
Yeah.
important, yada, yada. So tell me, I know that you've got sort of complaints about all this talk about innovation. There's lots of talk about hype. So can you summarize or sort of give it the big view that you're driving at?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about innovation and what I call innovation speak for a long time, but I'll let's just focus on innovation and hype for a second. And I think I can boil down, for the sake of this conversation, things to like 3 points. I think the first thing is that we know there's a big literature on the fact that hype often kind of accompanies new technologies, emerging technologies.
Yeah, sure.
And here, like I would point to my buddies, Brent Goldfarb and David Kirsch has this cool book, Bubbles and Crashes, on new technologies and bubbles and how they develop. And it's really about like, there's a lot of uncertainty around new technologies. We don't know how it's going to play out. And that allows like narratives to come along about how powerful things are. Okay.
Sure.
And that's
And
hype, right?
And we're certainly seeing this with generative AI, right? It's going to take over the world. It's going to replace all the human workers. Then going to use them as sex slaves. Like it's like
Yeah,
every possibly bad thing you can imagine, Gen AI is going to bring about.
yeah, and we just went through this with like Bitcoin and
Yeah.
blockchain and like so many technologies, right? So the second point then, which is my addition to like that picture that Goldfarb and Kirsch spot, is it was something I call criti hype, which is that it's not just positive over
Yeah.
unrealistic generalizations. There's also negative ones where like, and you were already spelling it out, like AI is going to ruin everything.
Right. The other is that I guess the other side, the positive side, is something like it's going to unleash human creativity because it's going to do all the jobs that we don't want to do, and we'll
Yeah,
be free to explore our personhood, and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's gonna fix all of the inequality, and it's like, okay.
Yeah, and I think criti hype exists for like this negative, like apocalyptic visions comes into being for a lot of reasons. But one of them is just like there's a market for that kind of stuff, right? You can make a lot of money
Mhm.
spelling out apocalyptic visions of technologies.
Yeah, I do have some, some people who are in the news today that I won't name explicitly, but yeah, I see them as just sort of opportunists. They're going, going really hard on their criticism, clearly because they want to make a name for themselves.
Totally, totally. And then just point three is that, and this is something I wrote about in this MIT Sloan Management Review piece recently. It's just because when you combine like hype and criti hype, it's really hard. It makes a really like bad information ecology, like this place to make decisions, right? Because you can't really trust what you're hearing. And so then, therefore, all kinds of decision makers, whether they're business leaders, policymakers, or, just us in our normal daily lives, whatever we're up to, it's really hard to make decisions given how bad the information is around us, around these things.
Okay, so the first claim was something like these new technologies get hyped. Is that the first claim?
Yeah, there's like, yeah. Hmm.
Second claim is something like they also get hyped in a really negative way. That's the criti hype piece.
Yep.
And third way is that it interferes with our ability to actually know what the hell's going on in the technology landscape.
Yep. You got it.
And what are we supposed to do about these things? Is there a sort of, I mean, I think it's plainly true, right? Everyone knows about, for instance, AI hype, blockchain you mentioned, or
Yeah.
Bitcoin in particular. Criti hype, see that there's a problem. I mean, so suppose I say, yeah, okay, that's just, so what are we supposed to do about this? Do you have a view about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like first you have to acknowledge that reality as someone trying to make a decision. And then I think it's about looking for information that you judge to be good by thinking about like what evidence it's based on, right? Like what
Yeah.
are people telling you? And just to use an example, like if you're a manager in an industry, you really want to think through, well, are my competitors adopting it? Like, are they getting a lot of boost out of it? Why do I think that's true? Like, is it just some rumor I heard or is it something I'm seeing? What's going on?
Yeah, so one of the major drivers is of the hype. Well, maybe not maybe a driver of hype, but a driver of doing something or other. I guess making false judgments is just FOMO,
Yeah.
right? So they're just afraid of missing out. Actually, yeah. So they're afraid of missing out, and so the fear. I take it isn't just sort of going to motivate people to do bad things, but I take it your point is something like the fear explains why they're not sort of rational thinkers about what do I actually have evidence for in relation to what others are actually doing. Am I really missing out?
Yeah.
What's the evidence for that? But if you're in the grip of fear,
Yeah.
rational thought is not sort of
Right.
is not forthcoming.
But I think that you really can, if you think through this stuff enough and kind of internalize it in your way of being, you really can get into a mode where another wave of technology hype comes along and you don't go along with that wave, right? You don't grab your surfboard or whatever.
So what's the advice then? What are
Hmm.
people supposed to do? I mean, yeah, look at the evidence, but are there certain kinds of signals that would indicate it's hype versus signals that would indicate, when I say signals, I guess this is just a business speak for evidence,
Right.
evidence for thinking that it's not hype?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the first thing is like, you have to just trust if you're an expert in your field, right? In your industry, then you have to think just like logically about how you think technology X might shift practices in or the way of doing things in your organization that would really benefit you, right?
Yeah.
And you need to like start from the presupposition that there's a lot of energy around new technologies and a lot of hype and that mostly that doesn't pan out. So that needs to be your starting point and say, well, I mean, maybe this one would because I can see it doing X, Y, and Z. And then I think the next point, and this is what, there's so many people who are like, let's not use Chat GPT or whatever. And I'm like, why? I don't get it.
Yeah.
And so then like, I think it's about reasonable demonstration projects because
Yeah.
it's like, and like allowing your teams to do it in ways that isn't taking up all their time, but you're allowing certain, and you're not scaling it. I mean, where you don't want to end up is that like, I have friends who, like work in consulting and give talks on technology to big companies and then, like, the CEO of the major beverage corporation in the United States told him that they had spent $10 million on like machine learning or some kind of AI in the 2010s and got literally zero benefit from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, that's where you don't want to end up is where you're doing some huge project because you believe in the potential of this thing. And there's just like, it's like vaporware or ghost
Yeah.
thing.
So I know, one complaint around innovation is the way that people talk about these things. So that's what you're sort
Yeah.
of talking about now, that innovation, I take it you might think innovation is fine and well, it's all well and good,
Yep.
but avoid the hype, both the positive hype and the negative hype. And I take it that really those first two claims fund the third one, which is something like the positive hype and the negative hype make it the case that you can't see clearly. You can't actually assess the landscape. Are there other, but you have other kind of things, other kinds of critiques of innovation talk, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and so I wrote about this in a book called The Innovation Delusion with my buddy Andy Russell. And part of there's an easy way to kind of break it down is that use of the word innovation shoots up after like in from like 1960 to the present. And there's
Mhm.
certain moments where it goes up even higher, like the 1960s and the 1990s are especially high periods. But basically, it's an unbroken curve from like 1960 to the present of just
Okay.
use of the word innovation going up and up and up. People are literally using the word more and more. But by no objective measure of innovation are we getting more and more innovation during that.
That's
Right?
that's interesting.
Yeah. And so by some measures, like if you look at Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth, like by some measures, like productivity measures, innovation's been much lower and actually negative sometimes from like 1970 to the present. We're just not
Mhm.
getting like the economic benefit of technology that we used to. And
How would
so,
how do we even measure that though, and how would we even think about that? I also kind of wonder what counts as an innovation.
yeah. And
If
so,
I add some new features, if I innovate to an existing product, if I innovated, does it always have to be a monumental thing in order for it to
Mhm.
count? Does it have to be the iPhone in order for it to count as innovation? How do we how are we supposed to think about this such that we can actually track whether we're innovating more or less?
Oh, it's totally I'm just setting up, like, the most extreme case here,
Okay, yeah.
right? It gets really complicated when you think about things like quality. So, like, the fact that we now have much nicer televisions and that, like, I'm like, my eyeballs are so experiencing this great pleasure is not showing up in productivity measures, right? So, like,
Right,
it's
right.
actually quite complicated. And that even, like, doesn't deal with, like, how social media affects politics or something like that. But I'm just saying, like, on, like by some measures, productivity or innovation's been really low, and yet we're hearing the word more and more, right? And
Mhm.
so this is like, I think that there's no reason to think that all this chatter about innovation is leading to more of it in, in many spaces, and we can show that in other ways too with organizations and such. So, I mean, I think that sets up the problem. And meanwhile, I think that this focus on the shiny and the new all the time often leads to this is the argument of the book, it often leads us to do things like neglect the stuff we've already built. So like maintenance and repair. We don't spend
I see.
nearly, we don't spend nearly as much time thinking about how to improve those processes in organization.
So, and then the recommendation I take it is something like, all right, so you really have to focus on things that are like use case specific.
Yeah.
Right? Don't get so excited about the technology. See if you can get excited about a particular use case for the technology. And then you've got to have something like an MVP and, what does success look like, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how you see this playing out. I mean, so like how do you see this playing out with like AI? And one place I've been thinking about is like regulation of AI, right?
Yeah.
I see lots of calls for it, but my first book, I wrote a book called Moving Violations, which is about the history of automobile regulation in the United States from like 1890 to the Google car, basically, right? Covered the whole thing. And for me, like when we think about regulating car crashes, like, crash tests
Sure.
and tailpipe
Seatbelts.
emissions,
Yeah.
yeah, all these things, like you have to have very clear ideas of what you're trying to do technically, and what you're trying to limit and what you're saying can't happen. And I see, like, when I see these calls for regulation of AI, I don't see any of that specificity. Like, I feel like, so I don't know. How are you thinking about how to deal with like risks, for instance?
Well, so the thing with AI regulations is that they have to be, as far as I can see, process as opposed to outcome oriented,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is not the case. You correct me if I'm wrong. This is your area of expertise, not mine. With automobile regulations. So with automobile regulations, it's something like, I don't care what you do, make it the case that it gets 50 miles per gallon by this year.
Yep,
I don't care.
exactly right
Just
about that.
figure out how to decrease the emissions to only release this much, right? So it's not about, those regulations are not about requiring a certain kind of process. It's about requiring a set of outcomes. Make it the case that this seatbelt will save people, whether they weigh, 100 pounds or 500 pounds or whatever it is.
Yep.
Right? They don't tell you how to make the seatbelt. They're requiring a certain kind of outcome.
Yeah.
The thing with AI is that, and really, I mean, any technology, is that it's so multi-purpose. It can be used for
Right.
countless things. So it's impossible to regulate the outcomes other than, don't kill people or something along those lines. So we
Right.
don't need new regulations for don't negligently kill people. And so it can't be outcome focused. You can't just say something like, make sure that it has fair outcomes. Like, what is
Right.
that? Oh, what is that?
What does
Okay.
it mean? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. What does that amount to? Or, make sure, I mean, I don't even know what the outcomes have to vary so wildly by case that I don't see how you have generic regulations, which means that if I think this is what this means. The regulations necessarily have to be process based.
Mhm.
Like, you should engage in these processes in the building of your AI throughout the AI lifecycle. So from the concept phase through to building and testing and validating to deploying and monitoring up to the point, even when you're, engaged in the act of retiring the AI, these are the kinds of things that you have to do. And it's going to be process oriented. Like, explore your data as potential sources of discriminatory outputs,
Mhm.
or assess whether it's acceptable to have a black box model for this particular use case.
Right.
And you can do all those things and it can be, compliant with the processes, but that simply doesn't guarantee any kind of outcome because there's no care.
Oh.
One
Yeah.
organization can say a black box model is acceptable for this particular use case,
Right.
and others will say, no, it's not. And so it's sort of like, what are we actually requiring here? David Danks has a really good point about this in a previous conversation that we had, which is something like, so I compared it to the criminal justice system. I said something like, for the criminal justice system, we don't just say you have to come out with a true outcome. We say you've got to engage in a certain kind of process. Jury of peers, certain kinds of evidence is not admissible, blah, 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 blah. And so we require a certain process, not an outcome. And David pointed out, rightly, I think, that those processes are required because we think that they reliably produce a certain kind of outcome. We
Right.
think that those processes
Right.
are good ones because they tend to set innocent people free and convict guilty people. Of course, it's not a perfect system.
Okay.
But we're doing the best we can to come up with the best processes to bring about a certain outcome. But we don't have that with AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
So You know,
The thing is, like, how does that become like a certification process then? Are you still like creating like agencies that are like making sure people are actually doing due diligence when it comes to this process checklist? I mean,
right.
it's
Yeah,
hard,
sorry, go ahead.
especially when you're going to have like potentially like, no, you're going to have thousands of firms doing this work, right?
Oh,
At
yeah.
least, yeah,
Yeah.
tens, maybe
Okay.
hundreds.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
and that leaves questions. And I talked about this with David as well a bit, which is something like, yeah, how are you going to monitor all this alleged due diligence? Is it
Right.
self attestation? Is it independent third party audits? Is it some combination? But it's complicated. And it's also difficult to see if it's going to do anything.
Yeah.
One thing that has perplexed me for a while about, third party audits or something along those lines is that it's always binary. It's, yes, you've done this or no, you haven't, or something along those
Right.
lines. But one thing that we need, ideally, it seems like, is, for instance, was, we need the right kinds of people in a room talking about the
Oh,
ethical
yeah.
implications of the thing, how to think about fairness for this particular use case. But all an auditor can do is say, yes, no, that's happened, or no, it hasn't. They can't evaluate the content of the deliberations and the
Yeah.
decision. And so what are we really checking for? We're checking for not complete and utter negligence that there was some conversation or other had. But I'm not sure that we have evidence that that check will have any kind of impact.
Yeah. And I think it gets a little bit, it's even worse in this sense is that, and I think that my field of science and technology studies tends to be very focused on the design, the early design phase, and in like the front end of the invention phase of
Yeah.
technologies, right? It's all about like whether, but really the impacts of technologies mostly comes from use. It's about how technologies get adopted and used in daily life by all these kinds of, and I think that these kind of design process conversations, like they're not even touching the harms of how like these things get used, right? Which is even more complicated because then you're talking about millions and billions
Right.
of people or firms or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll often highlight, listen, there are sort of three big risks of just stick with non-gen AI. Just,
Yeah,
the AI, the machine learning that everyone was talking about before OpenAI released ChatGPT.
right.
There's privacy violations, there's black box problems if that's a problem. There are problems of discriminatory models or models that lead to discriminatory impacts.
Yeah,
And those are the big three, and I highlight those are the big three because they're likely to be run into because of how ML works. I mean, if it's a
yep,
pattern recognizing machine that runs on lots of data, that data is going to run into privacy issues. It's so complex, the patterns, you get black box problems, and it can reflect the various biases in training data and other ways of getting, differential impacts across various subpopulations. But many of the ethical risks are use case specific.
yep, exactly.
And so you can't have regulations that do anything other than require a certain kind of process that
Yeah.
says, hey, look at the use case specific ethical risks.
I think this is part of the problem. So like, going back to where we kind of started this regulation conversation, the reason I brought it up is because of how bad we are at prediction. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is part of the issue is like the worst we are at predicting technologies is actually how they get adopted and used. We can know, like, it's just like, like you have like maybe a couple years lead time for a site, but 5 or 10 years out, you're
Yeah.
garbage. You can't foresee like,
Right.
the rise of TikTok when you're commercializing the internet or whatever. I mean,
Right.
like, and so this is like, for me, like there's a lot of push for like it's called anticipatory governance. It goes by other names in my field. It's like people even push like doing science fiction together and trying to foresee and then like regulating based on that. I'm like, this is bananas. Like you cannot see like that far out, like maybe
So,
you can, yeah, yeah,
but that's interesting. I mean, but you're putting us in a tough spot. And I mean, or maybe, and I might be on your team, but it's something like, okay, look, it sounds like one thing you can't do is just regulate a technology as such, because a technology it's too broad of a thing. It might be used for a
right,
billion different kinds of things. You create an engine and maybe you put it in a car, but
right,
it's not, you're regulating cars, and cars are not a technology. They're an application
yeah,
of a set of technologies. I would think that's the case, but you wouldn't say a car is a technology. That would be a weird thing.
yeah,
Blockchain is a technology. Machine learning is a technology. But again, you might think you're not supposed to regulate that stuff. You're supposed to regulate the purposes to which it's put. And then you might think, okay, well, let's do that in advance. Let's, before the shit hits the fan, let's
Right.
make sure that people don't use the technology for such and such. But then your point is, but we're really bad at knowing the purposes
Yeah.
to which people are going to put technology. So you're going to watch Star Trek and think it's going to be used for X when that's not going to happen. It's going to
Yeah.
be used for Y. But then we give up on anticipatory governance. And now we're supposed to do it retroactively. And there's two problems here, or two closely knit problems anyway. One is that, well, now the shit's already hit the fan. People are already hurt.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we have gotten out ahead of it? And relatedly, regulations take so long.
Oh,
So
totally.
the shit
Yeah.
will hit the fan, and then we still have to wait years and years and years to get
Yeah. No,
regulations.
exactly. But I
So
think
what are
problem.
we supposed to do then?
Yeah. I think the second problem, is actually the bigger problem,
Which one?
is that regulation takes so long.
Mm,
And, especially in the United States, the system, like our constitutional system is set up for inaction. Because it's like,
right.
it's like the minority is not supposed to be able to just push their views on everybody. That's how the whole thing was designed.
Right.
But and then when you bring like corporate power into the picture and lobbying all this stuff, it gets even worse. So I don't know. I mean, it's really, really hard. I don't want to point a picture where it's like if there's obvious harms from a thing and you can see it immediately, then act on it, right? I mean, like we regulated nuclear materials really fast, like when it comes to regulation, in like within a decade or something. And it's because it's like that stuff is really dangerous and obviously so. So I'm not saying like, I'm not saying we can't if there's obvious harms, but I think that like harms creep up on us. A lot of times we can't foresee them. We discovered that cars were producing smog like 70 years or something after the first cars were built. And like, and I think that we see like teenagers are getting depressed if they're on social media, or especially young women. That wasn't obvious. And when we're commercializing the internet in 1992 or whatever, but to your point, then we do see the harm. We have known this for years now that teens are getting depressed with social media and we don't act. So like, that's the tough part.
And that's really interesting. So people see the harms, they see the negative impacts, or they see what could come down the line potentially. They freak out in part because of the hype.
Yeah.
And then they go about getting after regulations like the EU.
Yeah.
And then, but the thing is, that's a bad move. So you might think the governmental response should be regulations to stop these things from happening. But your point is that that's not going to really work out very well because we're really bad at predicting what's going to happen. In fact, it may curb. You haven't made this claim, but I wonder if you would, and if you would make the claim whether it matters, whether it's sort of a bad thing for you. It would potentially curb unnecessarily innovation because there's certain things that companies are stopped from doing because there's a regulation that is based on a shoddy prediction about how things might unfold. And so what's interesting is it sounds like you're against, if you like, proactive regulation, because that is really something that only exists if your system is already sufficiently broken, meaning it's something that you call for when you know that your country is so bad at responding quickly to threats. So if you really want to make systematic long-term change, don't push for, say, regulations of AI or whatever new hot technology is out there. Push for a kind of structural change that will allow faster action on behalf of government when things actually do start going south.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. I mean,
yeah,
but that sounds really plausible and interesting. And, people don't talk about that sort of thing. We sort of take it as it's a given. Government is slow. Regulations are slow.
Right.
And if we take that as our given, if we take that as the assumption, then we have to fall back on, we better be proactive about this. But, I mean, I like your point a lot, which is don't take that as a given. That's the thing to push back on if you actually want to affect long-term change.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, what frightens me, I'm actually writing an essay about this very idea, this term. So I've been thinking a lot about this. What frightens me about it is then it pushes us to talk about how the U.S. for example, the U.S. political system is very non-responsive, and how would you make it more responsive? And then, that opens up just like such a difficult set of issues that, have been with us for a long, long time,
How do they do it with nuclear technology? I mean, you said that the regulations came quickly. So why was that different? I mean, it was an obvious threat. I mean, right now we actually have, from what I can see, bipartisan support. We have it for almost nothing, but we have bipartisan support around the evils of AI, if nothing else, privacy violations. Neither Republicans nor
Yeah.
Democrats love, at least
Right.
explicitly love, wide-scale invasions of people's privacy by corporations.
That's the more typical story is how we know there's a problem for a long time and we don't act on it for like 30 years, and
Yeah.
that's the story. Like we discovered that cars were creating smog in like 1950,
Mm.
right? Like we had the scientific evidence that cars were the things creating smog, the primary drivers. We didn't really create the legislation that created catalytic converters until 1970. And then it was even like a decade after that until like the catalytic converter stuff came online,
So
right? That's
is
the
the difference is the
story.
difference between the nuclear stuff? Every time I say the word nuclear, I get worried I'm going to say it like Bush did, and people made fun of him for the way he said it. And then
I
I'm going to
know.
say it by accident, and then it gives me anxiety about how the hell to say the word. And then I think I'm saying it wrong intentionally, like when you're looking at
Always
the
say it
thing.
wrong on purpose, I think. Yeah.
Nuclear. I think it's
Yeah.
nuclear. What did he say? Better not say it.
Nuclear or something like that. Nuclear. I have no idea.
Nuclear. Anyway, so why was it different with nuclear? Because it was not only that everyone know the threat, but the threat was so freaking massive. Whereas with emissions for cars, everyone knew the threat, but it seemed a lot less imminent or a lot less overall harmful. What's the difference?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it makes me want to go back and look at I want to revisit in the next couple of months, like the story of nuclear regulation and talk to my buddy Alex Wellerstein about this. He's a historian of nuclear stuff. Yeah, because I want to revisit and think really, really clearly about it. I mean, something like the story you're outlining is part of it. I think the other thing is that the nuclear industry was relatively small and concentrated.
Mm.
The automakers were big and popular in some ways. And they kept promising they were acting on it. Like for those 20 years, it was like, oh, we're going to take care of this, or like we're moving as quickly as we possible on this kind of stuff. There was lots of promising. And I think in the United States, generally, there's a culture of like avoiding regulation unless it's felt to be absolutely necessary. So it
Right.
take
Right.
took like 20 years of people getting really pissed off before we pulled the trigger.
Right. I want to come back to one thing, which is, something like requiring certain processes by regulation, which
Mhm.
don't increase outcome. I'll say sort of, let me sort of push back. I don't know if I think this, but I think it's plausible.
Mhm.
I think that a lot of people, sort of in in just people generally, don't want things to go ethically south. I mean, this is a very thin, it's a thin claim. It's like most people aren't sociopaths. that's
Yeah,
It's as
yeah,
robust
yeah,
as I
yeah.
want to claim. And then I think that they find themselves working for companies, doing certain things where those organizations don't take ethics seriously. They don't take the
Totally.
ethical risks of their technologies or the application of the technology seriously.
Right.
And so it's hard. It's hard to stand up to your employer. You rely upon them for a variety of reasons, most obviously financial reasons to support you, your family, your kids,
Yep.
etc. And so it takes a bit of a Herculean effort to say, hey, we got to talk about the ethical impacts of what we're doing here. And even if you do, you might not have any impact yourself because you might just get fired or just not listened to or ignored. So my point is something like the people in many organizations don't get the opportunity to actually have their say and have those words have an impact. They don't, no one's going to necessarily listen to them. But things would be better if they did.
Yeah.
And so then you say, okay, well, let's require a certain kind of set of processes that would require ethical risk due diligence, conversations with different people in the organization, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And so now you're creating the conditions under which, people can have these ethics conversations and we'd have better impact. And we would likely have better impacts because the ethics conversation is being had in some meaningfully, systematic way. They're not going to have that if it's not required by regulations. If regulations require it, or companies will have them,
Yeah.
and that will have a positive impact. It's not going to be ethical perfection, obviously, but okay, it's a way of getting the vast majority of people to communally talk about ethical impacts of whatever they're developing in-house.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, look, a lot of whistleblowers are heroes. objectively in some way, right? And I'm not saying I'm pushing back on these discussions that are happening within firms in very real ways about like, especially around like algorithmic bias and discrimination and such. Those are
Sure.
real conversations happening. And I'm also, like a lot of my colleagues, they talk to uh undergraduate engineering and science majors about ethics in the hope that they will graduate and be ethical people and do exactly the kind of things you're doing. I'm not even opposed to, if we created systems around this, I don't know what it looks like exactly what you're proposing, like how we would create a government agency in charge of processes around these kinds of stuff. I think part of it has to do with how we think about capitalism though. And, like
Mhm.
how this stuff plays out. And that, we've had corporate social responsibility. That was like an idea in like the 90s at the late,
Sure.
I mean, we've had these ideas around for a long time. And I think that I'm more of a regulationist at heart in that, like, I just think that, even if your firm does the right thing and it should do the right thing, and I totally support that, like someone else is going to be the bad actor. And this is like a reality of like the processes of capitalism. It has been for a long time. And, I think that liberal democracy traditionally has dealt with these, via these problems via regulation. That's how we've created really obvious positive change around technologies. And we can list all kinds of examples. But then as soon as I say that, it brings us right back to like the political process question and stuff like that, you know?
So, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, look, don't rely on you're gonna have to rely on regulations, but the regulations need to be more specific. They can't reach that level of specificity until we have actual use cases.
Mm.
And then we've got to, you know, come up with a better way of devising those regulations in a faster manner.
Yeah, that's where I end up.
Say, you brought in capitalism. Could you say a little bit about that? I mean, it's sort of in vogue now
To say
to
capitalism, yeah.
yeah, yeah, capitalism is bad. I mean, I'm not
No,
sure
that's not where I'm coming from, actually.
okay, yeah.
Of a social system and how it works, right? And I think that, what I like to show students this curve when I talk about technology and innovation and all this stuff, I show this curve. I might even gotten it from that second machine age book or something, but it's just like, you have like economic output, on a per capita basis. Like, so how much is each person producing? And it's basically like it's going up less than 1% for all of human history. And
Okay.
then it like hits like 1800 and it's just like a hockey stick, right? It just goes like through the roof.
Hmm.
And I think that really is like, that is the social system of capitalism coming online and how it has produced technological change, right?
Well, so sorry. I want to break it down a little bit. So,
Yeah.
what do you mean by social system? That's the social system created by capitalism. What does that mean?
Okay. So, I mean, like, as opposed to feudalism. So there used to be like lords and
Sure.
peasants, right?
Yeah.
And things changed. Like there's lots of different theories about why things change, but eventually you get things open up. You have companies, and and
Yeah.
they're not getting
Well,
taxed.
the Marx's story is the technology changes, so the means of production, the ways by which people make stuff changes. They can make more stuff than they used to. They can make more shoes than they could before. And so the lords could only wear so many shoes. So what do
Right.
the lords do? They take all the shoes that are being produced and they start selling them to you know, other lords who don't have shoemakers. And so you get,
Right.
that's the Marx story, right?
Yeah, and like there's non-Marxist versions of that same story. Like there's some kind of shift that happens in the 17th and 18th century that eventually leads to all this change, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because like when we talk about the Industrial Revolution is another way of talking about that. The Industrial Revolution was mostly about changing the way work worked initially, and only later in the 19th century does a bunch of technological change start happening.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
that's then we get huge, again, productivity or economic efficiency changes because like the assembly line comes on, we have transportation, all this stuff changes, right? And so that system has produced a lot of benefit. We all live in, even poor people in the United States have more material wealth than even like some middle class people did in the 20s or 30s or whatever,
Mhm.
right? It's produced a lot of benefit, but also there's all kinds of harms have come along with it, and then we can also look then at the history of regulation, which is how these societies have tried to deal with those harms, which is another story that has like a 120-year history or something.
So just I want to say on this point. So when you say, this is the social system that capitalism created. By social system, you mean something like, well, I guess I just still don't know. What do you mean by a social
No, I mean,
system?
I think capitalism is a social system. It's a way of
Okay.
relating to each other, and
I see. Like instead of relating to each other as something like lord to servant or serf, you're relating as employer to employee, something along those
as an
lines.
example, yeah, that's part
I
of
see. I see.
it.
And and so you know are you saying? And I don't think you are, but maybe you are. Look, we got to move past this capitalism stuff in order to fix the problems.
No, the way I talk about this is like, like it depends on how I wake up that morning.
Yeah,
Like,
totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
like 30% of the mornings, I believe that my like actual honest to God commie friends are right, that the only way past the problems we face as a society, whether it's climate change or poverty or whatever, is to
Yeah.
like just totally end capitalism. But, a lot of times I'm a regulationist. I think that we can use law to shape technology and other, wages and such in ways that
Yeah.
like take the edge off the worst parts of our system.
Yeah. One last question. So
Yeah.
there's people talk about techno solutionism, right? Which is
Yeah.
something that's supposed to be something like we can solve our social problems through technology.
Right.
Clearly, you're not one of those people, nor am I. I like to say that we can't math our way out of these problems. It's not like it's not
Yeah.
just a code. It's not. We don't have a coding problem. We have a social problem.
Right.
And what interests me is that you called yourself a regulationist, as opposed to, I don't know, maybe you think something like, I guess I want to hear what you say about it's not the technology, and it's not the sort of government structures explicitly or the laws on the book, so to speak. It's the culture, something along those lines. Is that suppose they say, I'm a culturist. Regulations are still a symptom. The regulations that we pass are symptoms of the kinds of culture that we have. And so the real thing is the culture. It's a
Right.
culture of, I don't know, not giving a shit about others, thinking that companies don't have any kinds of ethical obligations to society at large. They're just profit maximizers. So regulations are a band aid to the real problem, which is something like a culture in which sociopathic behavior is forbidden among individuals, but it's permissible if you put a bunch of individuals together and put an LLC after their name.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think so. Like, like the other way you can go with this stuff is like, there's a long lines of or long history of philosophies, like going back to like Martin Heidegger and people like this, where it's like what you really need is a cultural shift where we all wake up or something like that, and we
Yeah.
stop being assholes to each other, right?
But that seems less likely than just get passing some regulations.
Well, no, I don't want to. I mean, like if we all wake up, and achieve enlightenment together, and we start
Sure,
making
sure.
good together, that would be wonderful. But my point is that can show in so many ways that we have produced so much social benefit through regulation. And I
Mhm.
think we're actually not using these tools enough in our society, in part
Yeah.
because libertarian arguments work and are, so common and stuff like that. And so when I say I'm a regulationist, I'm like a pro regulation guy. But like, I think we have to do it right. And, part of doing it right in a democracy is that you need to either have evidence of harm, which would be like, the automobile example, or it needs to be very obviously demonstrable just logically from the get-go that something is really dangerous, like the
Yeah.
nuclear situation. And
Yeah.
otherwise, I think that, your best hope is for being responsively reactive as opposed to unresponsively reactive. You know what I mean? Like get on that problem as soon as it comes up and
Yeah.
deal with it.
I
Yeah.
like that way of characterizing it. I mean, it's sort of everyone thinks I put myself in this camp. Let's be proactive about this. We don't have to, and your point is no, reactive's got a bad name.
Yeah.
Proactive has a good name because it seems like it's really responsible. In fact, the proactive stuff lends itself to bad regulations because we're so bad at prediction. And so, no, be reactive. Just be reactive in a better way. That's the way to go.
That's basically where I'm at right
I
now.
love that. That's great. That's great. All right.
Yeah.
Lee, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. Appreciate you coming on and talking with me.
You too, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Later.